All right, it's 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and start rolling. We are in our study of the revolutionary Kingdom Declaration. So what we're calling the Sermon on the Mount. This is a radical set of teachings that have come through the pen of Matthew. And so as we're going through these, the Sermon on the Mount, really, we've been just really talking about all kinds of things around the Sermon on the Mount up to this point. A lot of introductory material, and I hope that you're patient with that, because it is going to really help us when we do get into the meat of the text, help us have a better understanding of these things. So don't lose patience with me as we are talking about these things. We've had several goals and objectives that we've tried to accomplish and that we're trying to accomplish along the way. And as you read through those and are thinking about those, I want to point out particularly today that we're talking about the failures of the Pharisees and scribes to understand Jesus and see why Jesus is exposing them. And this new paradigm that Jesus is discussing, we'll be talking a little bit about that. We'll also be talking about the structure a little bit more today. I'm very interested in Matthew and his very intentional structure of the Sermon on the Mount, as well as all of Matthew. As we've said already, the Sermon on the Mount really fulfills one of the 5 primary teaching blocks upon which the whole gospel rests. It is the first one. It is the most well-known one. And it is the one that Matthew really puts a lot of effort into in terms of its structure. We're going to see a little bit more about that in just a moment. We talked about the fact that Matthew, as he's introducing the Sermon on the Mount, he makes a point of describing Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecy. And as all of these things are coming to fruition, he keeps identifying all of these things that happened to fulfill prophecy. All of this leading up to these 3 chapters of Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He also describes Jesus in this really unique way of kind of depicting him as a new Moses figure who's coming to bring law. And of course, a big part of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus kind of explaining the law. He's not even bringing a new law. He's saying he is filling full the law. He's coming to fulfill the law. We said last week in chapter 5, verse 17 or so, that was kind of the theme verse of the Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus is the new Moses in the eyes of Matthew, as we've talked about this. And then we left off talking about this concept of the kingdom of heaven and how Matthew uses this term quite extensively throughout the entire gospel. And even here in the first 7 chapters that we're thinking about, this expression is found 7 times. So the repetitive nature of this expression, kingdom of heaven, lets us know that this is one of the primary themes. In fact, I believe it is the theme that Matthew is emphasizing through the teachings of Jesus. What the kingdom of heaven is, what its citizens look like, and what are their qualities. And we see this 31 or 32 times. Did anybody go back and count? Maybe that would be a good homework assignment. I said that I counted 31, but then I read an author who found 32, and I'm just wondering, which one did I miss? I'm sure that I missed one.
Translation.
But the kingdom of heaven is a unique expression found only in Matthew. Nowhere else in the Bible do you find the expression kingdom of heaven. The concept is there, but Mark and Luke especially refer to it as the kingdom of God. But Matthew's emphasis on the kingdom of heaven really paints or attributes, I think, a different flavor. And we talked about the fact that God created his kingdom to come from heaven and to meet earth. And Jesus is describing how that looks, what it looks like for God to bring his kingdom to the earth. And that's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. And that's what he's bringing to us at this time. And we talked about the fact that there were several philosophies of thought during Jesus' day who were anticipating this kingdom. They were reading the prophecies as well. They were looking for this, and they had different philosophies, such as the Pharisees, who were really focused on the law, and they were enforcing the law with exquisite attention to detail. And so much so that they were interpreting the law, and their very extreme interpretations of the law were bound upon the people because they were so careful in their observance of the law. And we talked a little bit about the Essenes as well, who were separatists. These were the people who had isolated themselves. They had this very narrow view that God's going to bring his kingdom, and it's going to have to be through us, because we're the ones that are prepared for it. We have left the world. We're separating ourselves from the world, and that is how God is going to bring his kingdom. The Sadducees' philosophy was they were going to be the ones who cooperated with the occupation of Rome and kind of negotiated how they were going to be powerful themselves. So they became power brokers in Judea and in Jerusalem especially. They controlled the temple. They were the ones who controlled the priesthood, and the priests and the high priests all were within this particular sect, the Sadducees. And then there was the Zealots, the ones who were the insurrectionists. These are the ones who said, we're going to help God along. We're going to make the kingdom come because we're going to crush the enemies of God. That's what we're going to do. We're going to rise up against Rome with political violence, with physical violence, and we're going to overthrow these enemies of God's people, and thereby God will establish the kingdom. Now, those were different ideas and philosophies about how the people of that day, or many of the people of that day, of course, the common people of Jesus' day, they didn't belong to any of these. They observed them, but largely the people that were attracted to Jesus were the disenfranchised, the fringes of society, the poor people, the powerless people. And they observed the Sadducees and their great wealth and their great power, and the Pharisees and their amazing righteousness, and perhaps they admired them from afar. But when Jesus came, he didn't come to any of these groups per se. There's a sense in which he came to all of them. But the ones who were gathered at that mountain weren't necessarily members of any of these philosophies. They were the common people. They were people who were just looking for something, who had nothing. So that's significant to understand the reading of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, as we think about these philosophies, I ended the class kind of with a rather dramatic statement last week. And the question that I had asked was, which of these philosophies most resembles the philosophy of Jesus? And I asserted that really it was the Pharisees that Jesus most represented. That philosophy of looking at the law and being true to it and being committed to it, that really kind of describes Jesus. Now, all of these things, we can say, perhaps Jesus shares some things with them, but the Pharisees probably resembled the philosophy of Jesus more than any. And then the obvious question was, which of these groups did Jesus find the opportunity to criticize the most? The Pharisees. Yes.
To your point, it's almost like when Jesus is addressing the Pharisees directly, it's because he's so disappointed in them, because they're the keepers of the law, because they've missed the spirit of the law, and that's why he's jumping on them. They know the letter of the law, they've missed the spirit of the law, and it's, to your point, I think it's like he's disappointed in them.
Yeah, in many ways they were the custodians of the law, and they had the admiration of the people. Oh, who are the righteous people? The Pharisees. Who are the ones that who should be teaching us and we should be listening to? Well, it's the Pharisees. That was their status in their society. And Jesus does criticize them more than others. And I made the point that, as we try to bring all of these things home and personally, you may discover that you fit into one of those philosophies in terms of the kingdom. Should we think about our relationship to the kingdom and our philosophies about that? And can you categorize people today in the same way, with the same types of philosophies? I think we certainly can. And I would say that probably I fit in that category with the Pharisees. I would have to say that. I appreciate what the Pharisees were trying to do, and I've kind of done that myself. And I have to say that I've made many of the same mistakes that the Pharisees made in equating the traditions of man and the teachings of man with the law of God. And so when I find Jesus criticizing the Pharisees, I really need to pay very, very close attention, because that's criticism of me as well. So do we have people who are like the Essenes? Well, I kind of talked about that just very briefly. I said we have people who have isolated themselves, like the Amish people. They said we're going to be in our own group, and we're going to be separate from the world. We're going to be so much apart from the world that we're not even going to mingle. We'll form our own society. That was not the intent of Jesus, and that was not what Jesus did, and that's not what he called us to do. Sure, we are to come out from among them and be separate, but Jesus said, I'm not going to pray to God to take you out of the world. I'm just going to pray that you not be of the world. Sadducees. We have people who act like Sadducees today who think that they're going to, with the help of the kingdom of Christ, gather some political power for themselves. Oh yeah. In the United States, we have people who under the banner of Christ, they say, this is how we're going to run the United States of America. We're going to take the teachings of Christ, and we're going to, and we might even find some political power for ourselves, and we might even ascend into the higher echelons of government. And so right now there is a very strong movement of Christian nationalism, where people are taking the kingdom of Christ and saying this can apply to the kingdoms of the world. And I tell you, that is a horrible, horrible thing. That's a horrible mistake. Jesus did not bring his message into the world to govern earthly kingdoms. It doesn't work. All you have to do is read the Sermon on the Mount. What kind of defense budget are you going to have if Jesus is your king? None. And what kind of border security are you going to have? Jesus said, no, welcome everybody. Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. Everyone. Did Jesus describe how to operate an earthly kingdom? Absolutely not. And it's a terrible mistake. And I think it's one of the greatest threats that we, as Christian people, have in our current political climate. That we have people who under the banner of Christ think that they're going to gather political power for themselves in the United States of America, or any other country for that matter. It's kind of a mistake the Sadducees made. Yeah, Chris.
I don't think it even has to be to the extreme of worrying about politics and things as much as it does, which would be more common, to mix as much of the world with your religion. And so whether it's the health and wealth gospel, or whether it's, I want to be well-known, well-respected, well-to-do, well-off, and I'll work Jesus in everywhere that I can in the meantime, and which would be very easy to do.
It really is a backwards philosophy, thinking that I'm going to use Jesus to be powerful in the world, or find my place in the world. When the thing is, we have to be here in the world, but Jesus should define who we are in every way. And then zealots. I don't want to be too controversial here, but we have people who have been insurrectionists in our own country. I remember on January 6th, people carrying these big banners of Jesus flags as they stormed into the Capitol. And I'm looking at that thinking, wow, what's going on here? Here are some people who claim to be Christians under the banner of Christ who are doing like the zealots. They're going to seize political power by violent means or by political means. And so, needless to say, I think that's a horrible mistake of philosophy as well. Jesus never intended for his people to become that kind of political activist to overthrow the functions of an established government. And, we could say even in history we've seen that movement quite frequently, where people under the banner of Christ, in the Crusades, for example, the Knights of the Templar, for example, gathering all this wealth and power to themselves. They become the great first bankers in the world because they have gone to Jerusalem to kick out all of the Muslims and to fight these battles. And then the Crusades continue under the banner of Christians fighting in this world to the cause of Christ. And of course, that is a terrible philosophy, terrible mistake. Jesus does not represent those philosophies in that way. So we can see ourselves, is my point. Society is society, and it translates many times in these very same ways. Let's move on. Unless there are other comments you'd like to make. All right. So, the Sermon on the Mount. Open your Bibles to Matthew. Isn't it about time we open up our Bibles to Matthew 5? All right. Open up to Matthew 5. What I want us to do today is take a look at the overall scheme and the overall structure of the Sermon on the Mount. I want us to gather an appreciation for what Matthew is doing here. Matthew is very intentional in building a structure of the Sermon on the Mount. And when you take a look at it from afar, you see the whole thing. I'm going to tell you, it's a beautiful thing. It is a masterpiece of symmetry and structure that I haven't fully appreciated until I really started doing this. And what I have discovered in all of my studies, reading various authors, hearing from other people, is that Matthew structures the Sermon on the Mount in triads. And what I mean by that is in groups of three. And I'm going to try to demonstrate this on the overhead here. So the first thing we need to know is that there are three parts to the Sermon on the Mount. There is an introduction, there is the body, and there's a conclusion. All right? There's your first triad. So we have the introduction. And included in the introduction are the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes, there are 9 of those. 3 sets of triads. And it begins with, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek or the gentle. The second triad, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart. And then the third triad, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the persecuted, blessed are those who are slandered and insulted. So as you're looking through your Bible now, I want you to kind of follow through with the logic that I'm presenting here. This is the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. Also included in the introduction are 3 metaphors. You are the salt of the world, you are the light of the world, and you are a city set on a hill. How many? 3 metaphors. Matthew is big on 3 triads. And so there's the introduction for you. You have the the Beatitudes and you have the three metaphors. And then we get into the main body of the sermon. There is that transition period, that transition phrase in Matthew 5:17. I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so this is the introductory remarks that he's making about the body of this sermon. And within the body of the sermon, guess how many points there are? Did somebody say three? Three, yes, yeah. Well, that's very insightful of you to notice that. And the first one has to do with the law, the Torah. Jesus is defining what his relationship to the law is. Some were accusing him possibly of trying to overthrow the law. He's saying, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill. And then he gives 6 case studies, 2 triads. All right, the first 3, you've heard it said, you're not to commit murder. But I say unto you, and you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, and it's been said that if you divorce, but I say unto you. So he gives these first 3 case studies, and then he gives another 3 case studies. When it comes to giving oaths or swearing vows, don't do that. You've heard it said that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, with regard to retaliation, and you've heard it said you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you something different. So Jesus is taking these concepts from the law. He is redefining, he is exposing the truth of these things. So that's point 1 of the sermon. Point 2 is practicing righteousness. The second part of the sermon is practicing righteousness. And he gives us some examples. How many examples does he give us about practicing righteousness?
3 or 6.
He gives us 3. You know it's a multiple of 3, right? He gives us 3. And the 3 examples are, when you give money to the poor, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And when you pray, don't do it like these folks over here, but do it like this. And this is where we find the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer, by the way, has 2 sets of 3 statements. He says, Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive our debts as we've forgiven our debtors. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Matthew, why is he doing this? What's the deal with 3? Third point, or third example is when you fast. Don't put on a gloomy face, he says. So that is the main, or that is point 2 of the sermon body. But then there's point 3, and that is the relationship that you have with God and your neighbors. And in these relationships, he gives 3 relationships, three points under this. And under each of these, he gives 3 points. So in these relationships, where is your trust is the first point that he makes. And then he talks about under this point, where your treasure is, there your heart is. And don't be anxious about your life and what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear. And your priority, seek first what? His kingdom and his righteousness. And all of these things will be added to you. The second part of this is that we need to avoid hypocrisy. And under that point, he talks about judging. Judge not, lest you be judged. By the way that you judge others, you will be judged. And value what is holy. Don't give what is holy to the dogs. Don't cast your pearls before swine, he says. And then he talks about having the things that we have based on asking, seeking, and knocking. Ask, and it will be given to you, he says. Seek, you will find. Knock, it will be open to you. This is the relationship you have with your Father. And he ends this section with, as you want people to treat you, That's how you treat them. So those are the three parts of this sermon body. And then we have the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. And there are some warnings given. Guess how many warnings he gives? He gives 3 warnings. 3 warnings. He says, all right, there are these 2 gates. There's a narrow one and there's a wide one. And I've given you all of this information. Now you're going to decide. And I'm going to tell you, it's the narrow one that leads to life. And then he says, there are 2 trees. There's good trees and there's bad trees. You're going to know them by their fruits. People are going to come. Teachers are going to come. You're going to have to recognize a true teacher from a false teacher. And then the last warning is, there's 2 foundations. And it kind of gives a parable here about a man who builds his house on the sand versus the man who builds his house on the rock. And that's the sermon. We could finish class today. We've been through the entire sermon now. But did you gather an appreciation for the structure that Matthew uses, the outline, the intentional way that he puts this all together? One of the authors I read said this about this, said, this is the epitome of Matthew's structural skill. We see it throughout the Gospel of Matthew, but this is where Matthew's really showing off. He's really showing off his ability to structure these things in this way. And the symmetry of this shows that he has a really advanced skill, advanced literary skill to accomplish this. This type of symmetry would be fully and very well appreciated in his day, especially this use of triads and these groupings of 3. So why do you think he did it like that? Was he just showing off?
So you just get endless sermons of 3 bullet points, right?
You know? Don't preachers do that today? Point 1, point 2, point 3. Let's stand and sing, right? Is there... Yeah.
I just go back to thinking, in school when we were taught how to write a proper report or a proper letter. You start with your introduction, and then you have your body of it, and then your conclusion, because that is the way you have to get, your point across or everything. It's just a better organization of it to make it make the most sense.
It makes the most sense. This is how human beings communicate effectively, right? Yes.
Maybe I'm ignorant of it, but shouldn't it have been verbatim just what Jesus said?
Well, there's debate about that. So if you go to Luke 6, you have Luke's depiction of the Sermon on the Mount, kind of, but he doesn't include all of it that Matthew does in this one setting. He includes different parts of it at different places. So some people believe that Matthew is taking some literary license here, and he is collecting all of these statements that Jesus made and taught everywhere he went, to every city. These are the things that he taught. Now, whether he taught them all in this same order, or whether he included every single one of these points in every lesson, there's no way for us to know that. But Matthew is describing this and collecting this, and I believe that makes the most sense, that he's collecting these in this one teaching block as representative of the things that Jesus taught everywhere he went, rather than this just being one event.
And rather than give Matthew all the glory for this, I think we ought to also say that this is the Holy Spirit directing him what to write.
Of course. Absolutely.
I was just thinking from a practical standpoint. I've never heard it laid out this way, with the 3s. So as I try to remember things, this is going to be a very useful tool for me to sit down and write this out so I can remember it, so that when I'm talking to people.
Yeah.
So from just a practical application.
So you know what? That was going to be my next point.
I'm sorry.
No,
Good segue.
Matthew could have been intending here's a good way to memorize. This is so organized and so methodical that you can categorize all of these things. And I'm going to try to do this on one slide for you right here. Okay? We're gonna get there in just a moment.
That'll save me so much time.
I'm going to try to get everything. Well, it's not everything, but the whole sermon on this one slide. And as we think about this, and I'm going to demonstrate something else for you here. And well, let's just go ahead and do this. But wouldn't that be a great way if you wanted to commit these teachings to memory? To do that? Anybody willing to commit to that? I'm not going to ask anybody to stand and recite the Sermon on the Mount, but consider that a challenge. I'm going to challenge you to memorize the Sermon on the Mount, at least in its sections. All right? And commit these things to your heart. And I believe that's what Matthew is trying to get us to accomplish. All right, so Matthew's Sermon on the Mount has three parts: introduction, body, and conclusion, as we just said. And within the introduction are two things. There's the Beatitudes and the three metaphors. The body has these 3 points about law, righteousness, and relationships. And the conclusion has the 3 warnings. Within the introduction, we have those 9 Beatitudes, and we have the 3 metaphors. And within the law, we have the 6 case studies. And within righteousness, we have the 3 points of how you give, how you pray, how you fast. And then within relationships, trust, hypocrisy, golden rule. And then the 3 warnings at the conclusion: the gates, the trees, and foundation. So that, on one slide, has the entire sermon in its organization. If you had that page in front of you as you're trying to memorize it, and you just took the cues off of each of these, I think that would very easily accommodate your memory to these things, and I think that is exactly what Matthew is doing.
You should share this.
I am. That's what I'm doing here.
You know,
Are you listening to me, Brad? Yeah. Let me just point out one more thing here. Within the center of this is the Lord's Prayer. And some people think that this is intentional as well. So we have 3 parts. We have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, right? So within the center of this, let's see if I can do this, is the body. And then within the body, we have 3 points, and it is within the center of that is righteousness. And then under righteousness, there are 3 points. There's give and pray and fast. And when he's talking about praying, that's the center point. And under the center point comes the Lord's Prayer. So where is the Lord's Prayer positioned in the Sermon on the Mount? It is in the center of the center of the center of the Sermon on the Mount. That is where we find the Lord's Prayer. The symmetry of that, it escapes me that could possibly be a coincidence. Is Matthew intentionally drawing our attention to the Lord's Prayer? It's hard to say with any certainty, but what a coincidence. That the Lord's Prayer finds itself right in the very heart, in the center of the center of the center of this magnificent structure. We find the Lord's Prayer. Now, the angels sing, right? Now, that's just amazing when that happens and that dawns on you. Yeah.
So, when I think about the Sermon on the Mount, I can't help but this even magnifies it a little bit more. Jesus is taking what the Torah taught and said, I am the fulfillment of this, and I'm going to live it out. And they didn't understand this at the time Matthew wrote it. But if you look at Deuteronomy, you'll see this same pattern. If you look at through Leviticus, you'll see the same pattern. Jesus is going to live this out in literal form. But if we miss this, then we're not going to catch what the intent I think Matthew had is. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were so amazed at his teaching. And he was teaching one with authority and not as the scribes. So if we walk away with saying, hey, this is a cool pattern, we miss the point.
I agree.
If I'm not amazed and want to bow down at my Savior, then I missed the point. That he is the fulfillment of this. And I've read the Bible many, many years, but I never get tired of reading the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
Because it always shouts to me, glory be to God for the saving grace of Jesus.
That's a great way to end our class
Oh,
today.
wow.
So thank you so much for your attention and comments.